Hajime! Greetings and salutations, legionaries. And so I have returned to talk about another dynamic of warfare, and that is the inherent paradoxes of warfare and the political. But what does this mean? What does it mean necessarily to be in paradox? Well, if you legionaries are well read, you would have definitely come across this great military scholar named B.H. Littleheart. And he talks about the circuitous path. And circuitous means the roundabout way, so the indirect, for strategy and success. And namely, what he talks about and levies as an example is the example of Hannibal, right? So remember Rome, Carthage, and for those of you who don't know the geography, Rome is situated in the center of Italy. Carthage is placed in modern-day Tunisia. And so the most direct route would have been to go and fight a maritime campaign and ultimately attack directly towards Rome or vice versa. But Hannibal Barca leveraged the indirect approach by effectively doing a forced march through the periphery of the Mediterranean, across the Alps, all the way allying and levying troops from tribes that are inimical to Rome and invade from the north. And through that exact, let's say, situation or branches, as de Saxe would say, he placed Rome on the back foot, because not only is it a massive psychological victory in the sense that he was able to do something that was extremely difficult, to say nothing, of course, of the fact that he levied psychological troops like elephants, which elephants, their efficacy on the battlefield, in the ancient battlefield, was strong, but it was also something that most didn't even know about. Remember, this is the time before the internet or books per se, and so you would hear about these things as if it was a Tolkienite type of story of Oliphants and these massive beasts, and so huge morale shock. But zooming all the way back, the idea of the indirect led Hannibal Barca to score a number of extreme victories, and had it not been for extreme figures such as Fabius or other great generals who were able to, in the fortitude of Rome itself, to accept grave losses and overcome their enemy, Rome likely would have capitulated and lost those wars. But they didn't, of course. But it still bears out the efficacy of the indirect approach. Now, there's this great scholar, Edward Luttwak. I highly recommend his books, especially when it comes to grand strategy of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the Soviet Union. All three of these, well, with the exception of the Byzantine, I have done writings or transmissions regarding that. But I highly recommend the one on the Soviet Union because the analysis still bears out in modernity itself and the more modern circumstances in which you're used to. Because for whatever reason, people believe that reaching out into antiquity to talk about modern concepts somehow is antiquated in the sense that it no longer bears out in efficacy. And that's couldn't be further from the truth. However, some people lack imagination and they need more brass tacks familiarity with things that they're more conventionally aware of. So, without further ado, legionaries, I'm going to start reading in a guided reading from Edward Luttwak. This book, which I'll be linking in the description below, is called Strategy, the Logic of War and Peace. And he's written a number of different books, treatises, and he's still active on Twitter. His personal, and Legionaries, I hope you understand, his personal political biases are not my own. However, just as Juvenal, or Ovid rather, once said, it's right to learn, even from the enemy. And though I don't consider him my enemy or my friend, I don't want you guys mixing up my personal convictions with his, okay? So please forgive. But in any case, we're going here, and we're going to talk about the conscious use of paradox, rather, the indirect. And I'm going to read here straight from Luttwak. Consider an ordinary tactical choice of the sort frequently made in war. To move toward its objective, an advancing force can choose between two roads, one good and one bad. The first, broad, direct, well-paved. The second, narrow, circuitous, and unpaved. Only in the paradoxical realm of strategy would the choice arise at all. Because it is only in war that a bad road can be good precisely because it is bad, and may therefore be less strongly defended or even left unguarded by the enemy. Equally, the good road can be bad precisely because it's the much better road, whose use by the advancing force is more likely to be anticipated and opposed. In this case, the paradoxical logic of strategy reaches the extreme of a full reversal. Instead of A moving towards its opposite B, as war preparation is supposed to preserve peace, A actually becomes B and B becomes A. So what does he mean? Effectively, if we're going to leverage the example of Hannibal crossing the Alps, right? The reason why it's successful and that maneuver on an operational basis was a successful one is because the Romans were expecting a maritime invasion, and therefore what they did was put all their emphasis and focus on levying troops, troop concentrations, and troop types with maritime fleets, levies and legions that were levied in the south, leveraging allies to be focused on the Mediterranean campaign, so seaworthy battles, and not focusing on Spain, which had been part of the Carthaginian suzerainty. I apologize for my mispronunciations here, but you understand what I'm trying to get at. And therefore, because it had been the expectation of the Romans that the Carthaginians would have chosen the most direct and safe route, that they encountered defeat when Hannibal crossed the Alps, took them unawares, took them unprepared, took the least experienced and second line, third line type troops and destroyed them at Lake Trasimene, and followed up those victories all throughout Italy, all the way culminating into Cannae. And so, once you understand this, and he'll break it down into a kind of more modern context, but you have to understand that morale plays a huge choice, and that there is this bias or conceit of us moderns who, through the Enlightenment, something that's been kind of an innovation in the last 200 years, is roughly fixated on the rational. And what does that mean? It means scientific basis of things, force compositions, force ratios, combat power being mathematically proven. And to a certain extent, these are things that are necessary. These are good things. Don't get me wrong. I don't want you thinking that you can't bind yourself up in the science of art, or, the science of war, because it's important. In fact, it's one of the reasons why the doctrine of air-land battle was so successful, and it was borne out in first of all, the First Persian Gulf, and then the second one was the invasion of Iraq. Now, remember, though, that the art of war, not the science of war, the art of war leverages asymmetries, the artful combination of the constellation of facts and data points, and involves the human agency, the human will, effectively the morale, the intangibles, which are things that you can't use a computer to predict. The circuitous path, which is to say the ones which are least expected by rationality, but can be seen or perceived by the human irrational mind. Because remember, we're not economic cogs like Adam Smith. Humans are fundamentally irrational. This is why economics is a farce beyond simply microeconomics, read Hayek, because ultimately humans are irrational and irrational actors, and not only are they irrational actors in the economy, they are irrational actors writ large. And no phenomenon of human history is more punctuated by genius in times of irrationality. Okay? And also extreme stupidity, of course, and people point this out all the time, but no one talks about that the secret sauce to military genius and leadership comes from the irrational mind. And, you can go into the placebo effect or the victor's mindset and the psychological basis of this, but it's also leveraging material wealth and the material hard capital of combat to exacerbating asymmetries where otherwise they would not exist. So anyway, I get sidetracked here, and so he kind of backs up his case, and he says immediately in this, and I'm reading again from the text: "Nor is this example contrived. On the contrary, a paradoxical preference for inefficient methods of action, for preparations left visibly incomplete, for approaches seemingly too dangerous, for combat at night or in bad weather, is a common expression of tactical ingenuity, and for a reason that derives from the essential nature of war. Although each separate element in its conduct can be quite simple for a well-trained force, a matter of moving from one place to another, of using weapons in ways drilled 100 times before, or issuing and understanding clear-cut orders, the totality of these simple things can become enormously complicated when there is a live enemy opposite, who is reacting to undo everything being attempted with his own mind and his own strength and his own will." End quote. So, obviously, these are things that kind of I've already touched on previously, but just to flesh out in a modern context where this exact situation played out is the Armenian-Azerbaijani 2020 war. So, for those of you who don't know, and I wrote a thread, I suppose, about this, and I wrote about this extensively, but talking about leveraging special operation units, the law of small numbers, but also pursuing the circuitous path on even the tactical level of combat. And so, for instance, just long story short, just to bring it short and make sure it's more concise, these two armies were fighting each other in a conventional setting. The defending force, which were the Armenians, had a superior position, to restate the obvious, but they had a superior defensive position. They had entrenched bunker systems, reinforced concrete bunkers. They had pre-sighted coordinates of specific likely areas of staging, positions, and so on. So their artillery was already clocked in. Everything was set in their favor. However, they weren't counting on the defense of Susha, which was the decisive point of the entire operational battlefield. And the reason why is because the terrain of this basically operation was dominated by this high peak. This high peak was the site of this very ancient town, village, city, whatever you want to call it. It's a very small town. It's like 25,000 people. And on three sides, it was located on a very sheer hillside, so you actually had to physically climb up the sides if you weren't going through the most likely area or the MLRS, this line of supply. And so the Armenians were very confident in the defense of this decisive point and the decisive on the line of contact as well. So what the Azerbaijanis did is basically pierce the front line, even though it was very minimal, and they infiltrated through the lines. They scaled this very difficult terrain on the side of Susha with a detachment, I think it was a regimental-sized element, climbed the sides of Susha during the middle of the night using only, hand-eye coordination, no voice, no electronics, and by surprise and shock, in the morning, took the town of Susha and therefore sighted necessary artillery positions on it and the entire operational basin, which the Armenians had been contending the Azerbaijanis for, the Nagorno-Karabakh, whatever province, fell. So this bears out in reality. This is not just, speculation or ancient citation. This happens all the time, and it's precisely when you're on the battlefield that you should be pursuing the difficult path, right? The difficult path, if you have the team that is capable of leveraging that, to leverage the asymmetries of combat power to your advantage. Mr. Luttwak goes into this a little bit deeper, and I think you should hear his words because I think they really do bear out in reality as far as what I mean by the exact metrics. What is at play in the intangibles? What is the irrational? What is the asymmetric here being leveraged? And so I'm just going to pick up reading now. First, there are merely mechanical complications that arise when action is opposed by the enemy's reaction, as in the naval battles of the Age of Sail, in which each side tried to present broadside guns to impotent prow or hull, as in the classic gun combat or fighter aircraft, when each pilot seeks to position himself behind the enemy, and as in land combat perpetually, wherever there are strong fronts, weak flanks, and weaker rears that induce reciprocal attempts to outflank and penetrate fronts. To think faster than the enemy, to be more clever in shaping the action may count for much, in parentheses, although good tactics may be bad, as we shall see, end parentheses, but cannot in themselves overcome the elemental difficulty created by the enemy's use of his own force, of his own deadly weapons, of his own mind and own will. In the imminence of possible death, the simplest action that increases the exposure to danger will remain undone unless all sorts of complex intangibles of individual morale, of group cohesion, of leadership, can overcome the individual instinct for survival. And so, end quote. And so this is why I kind of emphasize so much in Lance's Legion, because warfare and war, I've explained this dichotomy multiple times, but just to reiterate, war is the eternal principle. Warfare is the manifestation as it exists in our space-time, in the sense that, the terrain, the physical terrain, the technological terrain, the exact ways or modalities of convention of warfare exist as now the intangible operating system / ideology of the time, the zeitgeist, so to speak. And so that's warfare. But war is always eternal, and the eternal principles of warfare are always these things that he talks about. So individual morale, group cohesion, and of leadership. Incidentally, this is the reason why virtue ethics, as I've explicated before, is so important. It's about focusing on precisely those values that you inculcate in yourself, in the soldier, in buttressing all those different elements: leadership, personal virtue, all these things. Virtue in the sense of actually what is effective for the warrior, and not what others describe it to be, which is being a good boy, pat in the head, that kind of stuff. So don't think about it that way, all right? So think about it in the ways that actually make you effective in the Greek sense, the arete effectiveness, right? So reading from the text again, and this is Luttwak. To obtain the advantage of an enemy who cannot react because he is surprised and unready, or at least of an enemy who cannot react promptly and in full force, all sorts of paradoxical choices may be justified, violating common sense criteria of what is best and most efficient, as the shorter route is preferable to the longer, as daylight is preferable to the confusions of night, as completed preparations are preferable to hurried improvisations. The bad option may deliberately be chosen in the hope that the unfolding action will not be expected by the enemy, thus diminishing his ability to react. Surprise in war can now be recognized for what it is, not merely one advantage amongst many, such as material superiority or better initial position, but rather the suspension, if only brief, if only partial, of the entire predicament of strategy. So, okay, great. End quote. And this is really the crux of where the art overcomes the science. And this is exactly where the irrational mind forms its asymmetry over the rational. So many people want to leverage things from a technical perspective. And Luttwak talks about this, about the guys that are doing the developments of R&D, who want to focus so much on the technique of war, but never talk about the art of war. And it's precisely in this example, for instance, choosing the vulnerable, logistically vulnerable, the situationally vulnerable, the adverse night and geographic conditions of that special forces regiment that I talked about earlier, is the reason why it leveraged those law of small numbers and success on the battlefield. So if that makes sense, what I'm trying to do is explain to you that the irrational, the circuitous, the indirect approach, surprise, in its very essence, is about being a force multiplier. Check that. It is completely sidestepping the situation of the moment and seeking a way to break logic on the very cliffs of the irrational will. And to bring it full circle, Legionnaires, and this will be a short one, this is going to be a hip pocket class because I want you to be able to masticate these ideas and take it upon yourself to read, because this book is a massive book, but I think the core element still maintains this central premise that ultimately on the battlefield the enemy gets a vote, which is to say, implied in that phrase, which is a truism if you've heard from anyone, that we are not acting on a static, inanimate object like nature per se. There is no standard way of dealing with things. The laws of war, quote unquote, at most amount to a heuristic. And what is the difference between a heuristic and a deduction? I hope this is important. So, logical deduction and logical induction are two different things. Inductive reasoning comes from using past experiences and using them as a rule of thumb for most successful outcomes. Whereas deductive reasoning is the inverse, right? It's not by using data points, but rather by annulling other possibilities to arrive at the central modicum. But because warfare and economics and psychology and everything else that touches the human animal is fundamentally multifaceted, it's dynamic, it's robust in the sense that it's irrational, because humans are irrational. They're operating under circumstances of friction, under circumstances of duress, under circumstances in which they're human beings and not AI. They're not computers. And so, therefore, war will always revolve around heuristics. And in so doing, you must understand that this is both a vulnerability and an opportunity, because your enemy also operates off of this misunderstanding as well. Your enemy also is reasoning from a position of a human being. Even if it's the case, and this is why I'm a critic of AI in general, when it comes to integrating that into the C2 of modern militaries, is that it sets us up for a circumstance, much like that of Vietnam, in which we're waging war on a rational front that is fundamentally an irrational phenomenon. And this is not to say it's a bad phenomenon, right? Because we've inherited this conception from the Enlightenment in which everything irrational is bad. This is not what I'm saying. I'm actually trying to leverage this as the human genius. This is the delineation between a soul and simply a computer mechanism. No. My friends, this is the secret to success, and this is the very element what here in Lance's Legion I'm trying to instill in you, is this very idea of the irrational mind being superior to that of the rational when it comes to using it in a day-to-day lifestyle. So remember, and this happens in combat operations as well, is the idea is that you should master the rational, but it is only a tool. Rationality is only a tool. It is not the end. It is not the everything. It's not a totality. It's simply a tool. And there have been many case studies in which, I mean, not just simply in real life, but classical logic does not actually bear out 100% in real life, like in science or otherwise. So you have to understand that there are limitations to this tool, and we're finding the ends of these limitations in conflicts. I mean, whether it's in conflicts such as Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. By every metric, rational metric, we should have won. But we didn't, because ultimately the human will is something irrational. And to leverage that, or to orient off that, is the most important thing. And this is a Clausewitzian quote, but remember, this is probably the most important thing you'll come across. The essential difference is that war is not an exercise of the will directed at an inanimate matter, as is the case with mechanical arts. In war, the will is directed at animate object that reacts. It must be obvious that the intellectual codification used in the arts and sciences is inappropriate to such an activity. And so ultimately, this is just an underscore of what I explained to you previously. But let me just leave you this with Edward Luttwak's last word here. And we'll continue this as a series because his books are so dense and they're so rich in content in the sense of actual nuggets of knowledge that I think I would be doing it and you a disservice, Legionaries, if we did not take time to really analyze and gestate all this wealth of knowledge compiled from his personal experience, but through his expertise and reading, that I think what we should do is dedicate ourselves to a more concerted reading of the circumstance. So anyway, as I part, here we go. The logic of strategy no longer applied because of the enemy's reaction. Indeed, it's his very existence as a conscious, living entity that is the make or break of every combat operation. So, in summary, Legionary, what I want to explain to you is this. The rational mind is good for many things, but remember, it's a tool. And in war and in life, as life is war, and you'll see in this series that I'll be putting out, the irrational is what wins over the rational. Daring, boldness, likely taking enormous risks for things which may not bear out, leveraging the law of small numbers to your advantage, will be the difference between your genius and success and victory and the enemy's ultimate defeat. If you have any questions, I want this to be more interactive, and therefore, if you have any questions, please comment below so that way I can explain them and so that way I understand where you're operating from, and ultimately we can go into depth and talk about this central premise of what really amounts to the art of war. Because remember, there are two different things. It's the science of war, which is talking about the techniques, the conventional battle drills, all the small things which are, brought down to a science, and the intangibles, the things that are the genius, the thing which separates the mediocre commander from a Napoleon. And so with that, Legionaries, I must go back onto patrol with Sergeant Barnes here. Make sure those men are looking for the indirect approach. Make sure that they're entrenched in ways that they hadn't known could possibly be the case. Those interlocking fields of fire are aimed at the most improbable, just as the probable position be the correct one. And with that, this is Technica. This is Lance Legion signing off. you.